into making accessible webinars, accessible documents. Focus on giving a webinar right now. So that's the webinar today, is on accessible documents. We'll be walking through Microsoft Word, talking about some of the features in Word that will help you to create accessible documents. And that said, I do want to remind everyone that this is a 1-hour webinar, so we are not going to dive deep into the workings of Microsoft Word. This will introduce you to the basics, but the basics are oftentimes, 80% of the way there. So that gives you something to start with, and then after the webinar, I can send out additional resources for the super users that get a little more fancy with their Word documents. So before we begin, some housekeeping. Live captions are available. Monique has posted the link into the chat, but it's a short bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/SBCTC live. And again, if your audio drops out during the webinar, you can always open up the live captions and follow along that way. There is also a call-in option available if you're having problems connecting your computer to the audio. And that call-in option is phone number 415-655-0002. And the access code is 926-162-149. Monique has also posted that in the chat. And if you have any troubleshooting, you need help with something, my chat is closed. So I won't be tracking the chat while I'm presenting, but you can contact Monique either through the chat or at her email, which is mbelair, so MBELAIR @sbctc.edu. And just a huge thanks in advance to Monique for helping with this. We have over 300 people registered, so she's working her magic to keep everything under control. That said, also, I don't have a note on the screen, but my chat is closed, and the default chat in WebEx is that your chat messages will go to me. So you want to make sure if you are submitting anything via chat that you change that setting to everyone. It's a feature of WebEx that's kind of unfortunate. So if you do have questions, they will be addressed at the end rather than the middle of the webinar, and that's just to try and make sure we get through everything in a timely manner and then hop on over to questions. And before I forget, actually I think Monique, since you're the host now, I need you to press record.
I already did.
Oh, well, thank you.
Oh, well,
so,
there you go.
So then let's go ahead. I'm going to switch over to a Microsoft Word document. And what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through what is an inaccessible document. And sorry about that, let me stop sharing so I can get rid of the other screen. There we go. All right. And if you're in WebEx, there is a way to zoom the screen. There's a menu bar at the top where there's a magnifying glass that you can press. And you can also close out the participants in chat list in order to widen your screen up. That's something I can't control for you, other than I'll make it larger on my screen. But the rest of you might need to play around a little bit with the WebEx interface in order to make that larger. To zoom out, you can also, I guess I'm looking at a Mac here, I can do Command greater than sign in order to zoom in. But up at the top, there's a View menu that you might be able to use to adjust those settings as you need to. So one thing I want to mention is that this document, it is inaccessible. So we're going to go through, we're going to fix it and make it accessible, but also the document includes instructions for how to make Microsoft Word documents accessible. So I'll be sending this document out with the webinar recording so that you can kind of work through it on your own later and follow those instructions to make it accessible. So it's kind of a good practice follow-up for today's webinar. So the first thing I'm going to start with is just talking about how text is really kind of the most often used format for presenting and sharing information, and it's also the most accessible format if it's formatted correctly. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use the tools available in Word and some extra ones I want to talk about to make a document accessible. So the objectives for the webinar is to go over how to apply headings to a document, how to add alt text to an image. We're going to talk about using tables appropriately and formatting them for accessibility, using appropriate fonts, font size, color to improve readability, and then a few other tools to help format text and also to check your document. So the first thing and really the most important piece of making a document accessible is adding headings. So sighted viewers can scan a page and look for kind of visual cues like larger or bold text in order to find the section of the document that they want to read. But if someone's using a screen reader or text-to-speech technology, these visual markups can be useless. And so imagine if you have to navigate a document word by word from the start of the document all the way until the section that you want. That might not seem like a big deal if it's a one-page document, but if you've got something like a 15-page document and, think about, you can't scroll through, you can't scan the document to find what you need, but imagine if you can only use the right and left arrows of your keyboard to navigate through that document. That's not going to make for a very kind of easy or convenient experience. So what headings do is headings actually allow you to jump from section to section. They essentially create an outline of your document, allowing someone using assistive technology to navigate from section to section in order to find what they need. And that's pretty important because I think a lot of the content that we create is not always meant to be read from the start all the way through. But especially if you're creating reference materials or, you've got something like a syllabus, oftentimes that's something people are referring back to and, are looking for specific information. And so headings can really help us. So what we're going to do in this document, which currently doesn't have headings, and the way I know is that when I click on what looks like it should be a heading, because it's larger font, it's bold, the title of a section, and it's called headings. When I look at the Styles pane, and I'm up on the Home tab of Word, and the Styles pane normal is circled, it's selected. And so that's telling me this is just normal paragraph text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by going to the title of the document, and I've moved my cursor to the title, How to Make Accessible Word Documents. And I'm going to go up to the Styles pane and select Heading 1. So you can either do that by clicking on Heading 1. The other option is you can do Control, Alt, and then the number. So 1 will make it Heading 1. And then for this document, I'm only going to have one Heading 1. That's the title of my document. And the sections that fall under are going to be Heading 2 because we use headings in a hierarchical manner. So they're nested under one another. So objectives, I'm going to make heading 2. And you can see once I make it heading 2, the heading 2 box in the styles pane is then circled. So for the headings section title, I'm also going to make that a heading 2. But then I have a subsection underneath. So I have the section title headings, and then I give my kind of discussion that I just gave about why we want to use headings. And then I have a subsection, which is titled How to Apply Headings. So I'm actually going to make that a heading 3. And that's because it's nested under this section titled Headings. Now for alt text, we're at a new section. I'm going to make that heading 2. But again, I have a subsection, How to Add Alt Text to Images. And I'm going to make that section title, that subsection title, heading 3. And so I'm just going to work through the document adding these headings. And you can see it's really not taking me that much time. So sometimes it seems like to fix a document, it's going to take a lot of time. And that's actually not always true. This is a simple, pretty simple task. So getting to the end of my document, we're almost there, bear with me. And you can see not everything changes over to look like the other headings. That's not too big of a deal. We don't need to worry about that right now. But I've now added headings to the full document. And that probably didn't take me, I don't know, more than 2 minutes to do, given this is a 2-page document. But again, it was pretty simple. So that's how we add headings. One thing I do want to walk through that's not discussed on the document is how to modify those headings. I'm not a fan of the default look in Word, and I also don't think the light blue is ideal. So if you're really kind of married to the look of your document, chances are you've gone in, you've done some manual formatting, and you don't want to move away from that. You've spent a lot of time making your document look the way you want it to. It's okay. You can actually save that look, and there's a couple of different ways to do this. So first, with the title, I can reformat it. I'm going to use Century Gothic, and I'm going to use a dark, dark blue. I'm going to center my title. I think that looks good. So while I'm on the title, I can modify the heading. And I can do that by going in and right-clicking on that heading level 1 from the Styles menu. And I can select Update Heading 1 to match selection. And so now you see heading level 1 in the Styles pane looks like the text I just reformatted. So if you're really married to the look of your document, you can actually go in, and rather than just apply heading level 1 or heading level 2, you can right-click and select Update Heading to match selection. And that way you're adding in the heading levels without even altering the look of your document. But this also saves you time because let's say, for heading level 2, I want to change the look. And this is just another way to do what I just did with the title, is I'm right-clicking on heading level 2 and selecting Modify. And here I've got the formatting pane where I can, again, I'm going to go Century Gothic, it's bold. Let's maybe make it 14-point font. I'm going to make it a nice dark orange color, and I'm going to click OK. What happened was everything that had been marked a heading level 2 changed. In the past, I would have gone through and manually formatted each title. And then I would have gone back and I would have changed it because I always change my mind on how things should look. and I'd have to go through the entire document to make those changes. But by putting in that heading structure and simply modifying the heading level, those changes ripple throughout the entire document, which saves me a lot of time. And so I can go in, I can do that for heading level 3. I'm going to stick with my favorite Century Gothic, bold. I'll do a dark purple. And one thing I want to point out, if you really like the look of it, and maybe you're working on making sure it matches the brand for your college or agency, what you can do is you can select new documents based on this template when you're in that modifying styles pane. And when you hit OK, that means anytime you create a new Word document, those settings, those kind of modifications that you've made are saved. So you don't have to go in and modify them each time. Again, I think that's a huge time saver. So I've modified the headings enough. I think they look fine. So we're going to move on. So the next piece that we're going to talk about is alt text. And alt text refers to alternative text. It's text that's associated with an image so that someone who's unable to see that image understands what that image should be, the information it's conveying. This is great for someone using a screen reader or speech-to-text. It's also really good if the image breaks. So if the image breaks, then the alt text is displayed, and that makes sure everyone knows what that image is there to convey. Alt text should be under 100 characters, and it's pretty much a short and sweet description of the image given the context in which it's presented. So you want to think about why are you using that image. In the last webinar, we talked about Mount Rainier. If you're, marketing the Pacific Northwest and you've got an image of Mount Rainier, you're probably going to give it different alt text than if you're teaching a geology course. In that geology course, you're probably going to talk more about what type of volcano Mount Rainier is and some of perhaps the features of the volcano, again, depending on what context you're presenting that image in. So it's pretty simple to add alt text to images. You can right-click on the image, or the keyboard shortcut once you get to the image is Shift F10. So let's go track down an image. Oh, goodness. I removed all of the images. Oh, here's an image. Okay. So here's an image in the document. So we're going to open up that formatting pane. And in the version of Word I'm using, they kind of hide it, which is a little frustrating. It's over in the Layout and Properties tab. And once you expand the alt text menu, there's two options here, the title and the description. And for alt text in Word, you want to type it into the description box. So here, I'm just going to type in, let's see, screenshot of, it's the Finder window when saving a document with arrow pointing to options button. That might not be the best alt text. There is definitely an art to writing it, and writing it with an audience of who knows how many doesn't help. So in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and leave it at that, and that will give alt text to that image that's later in the document. So I'm going to close that out now. And go back to our section on alt text. So one thing I do want to point out is if an image is purely decorative and you want a screen reader to just entirely skip over it, there's no need to read the alt text then what you need to do is you still have to go into the image, and in that description pane, you hit the space bar and then press enter. And that will ensure that the image is completely skipped over and ignored. And so it's important to point that out, because sometimes people think, oh, I just won't even mess with the image. I won't put in alt text, and that way it's skipped over. What will happen is if you don't go in and either put in alt text or the null alt text, a screen reader will still read that there's an image. It just won't be able to tell the person what that's an image of, and that's really problematic. So whether the image is decorative or not, you always have to go into the image and put something in the description, either the actual alt text, the description, or the null spacebar enter. So one tip there. Okay, so the next piece, and I just saw a little chat pop up about alt text in action. No, you can't see alt text in action because I'm not using a screen reader. I'm not going to be able to even turn on a screen reader for you to be able to hear it. Alt text is something that if the image is there visually, then you don't need the alt text. The alt text is providing an alternative for someone who cannot see the image. So to know if there is alt text, you go through the same steps as you would to add alt text. So maybe at the end we can replay how to add the alt text, since I just did that. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. This is why I try not to look at the chat during the webinar. So in terms of tables, the important thing you need to know about tables is that tables should only be used to convey data, never used to control the layout of a document. And so if you're using assistive technology, it's going to read a table from left to right, starting at the top. So the relationship between the cells is not going to be defined if it's not formatted correctly. So I have a table in this document, and if we were just reading across, it would say county of residence, number of employees, average commute time daily. Thurston, 1:20, 10 minutes. Mason, 10, 20 minutes. Pierce, 20, 30 minutes. Lewis, 5, 20 minutes. It's a pretty simple table, so it might be able to make sense of that. But imagine if you have more complex data or more columns and rows, it'd be really, really easy to kind of lose track of where you are if that table is not formatted correctly. So to create an accessible table, we're first going to start by adding a caption for the table. And that's either by selecting the table, or you can do kind of keyboard shortcut. I'm going to ask that someone just unmuted themselves. If you could mute yourself, that'd be great. So the keyboard shortcut is Alt plus SP, and that automatically brings you to the window to add a caption to your table. So for this table, you might say, average commute time by county. Short and simple, quick description of what the table is about. You can decide if you want the caption above or below the table. Here, I've just got it right above. And then the next thing you want to do is navigate to that top row that includes the category titles. At least for this table, we have the category titles there at the top. And you can right-click the row and select Table Properties, or you can do Shift F10 and navigate to Table Properties. And then I'm going to go into the Row tab, and there's two things I'm going to do here. First, I'm going to uncheck Allow Row to break across pages. And then second, I'm going to check Repeat as Header Row at the top of each page. And then I'm going to click OK. And the reason why you want to do that is if this table were to expand on to a second page, this header row would appear at the top of the second page so that a viewer doesn't have to kind of look back and forth between pages. So again, it's a step that helps everyone, but it also ensures that that top column, at least for this table, is a heading. And what that means is that when a table's read, the heading will be associated with the data that falls underneath it. So we would hear County of Residence Thurston, number of employees, 120, average commute time daily, 10 minutes. County of Residence Mason, number of employees, 10, average commute time daily, 20 minutes. So it's a little bit more meaningful as you go through each cell because it's connecting the information in that header row to the data cells. So again, makes it much easier experience for someone who's using assistive technology. So in general, tables can be a huge pain. And my best advice to you is try to keep them as simple as possible. Avoid nesting tables within tables. That can be a huge problem. And really avoid using tables for layout. There's other ways to control layout without tables. Looks like someone's chomping away on lunch. Oh. All right, the next piece here is about formatting text. There's a few different tools that are available in Word that will help you format your text. I probably should have prefaced this whole webinar by saying I'm a little bit of a control enthusiast. So I was self-taught on Word, and I was all about kind of manually manipulating everything. I hated the tools that Word comes with because they just didn't do things the way that I wanted. But as I've learned more about accessible documents, I've learned how to use those tools to my advantage and really just how to use those tools. So I think that mostly applies when it comes to these issues about formatting text. So the first thing I want to talk about is using lists in Word. And so you want to use the bulleted or numbered lists by using Word's formatting tools. And this is, if we go back to the Home tab, I've got both the bullets list available as well as numbered lists. And there's something a little wonky about this when it comes to keyboard commands. You can add a bulleted list through the keyboard with Control-Shift-L, but there's no shortcut available for numbered lists. That's something you actually have to program in yourself, which is a little unfortunate. So back to fixing our list. What we want to do, and what I do, I have a list here on, it's the steps for how to reformat a list, and I've titled each step, Step 1, right? So I'm using step and then the number. Step 1, delete whatever is being used to define the item. And oftentimes that's a dash or a number, or in this case it says step 1. And the reason why I know this list is not formatted as a list is that when my cursor is on it, those list icons that are up in the formatting ribbon are not going bold. But if I go to, let's see, the list, that was the instructions on how to create an accessible table, notice that the numbered list becomes shaded. And so that way I can tell that's been formatted as a list. But when I look at the instructions for how to reformat a list, it's no longer shaded. So I'm going to delete out what's being used, which is step 1, step 2, step 3. Actually, I'll just delete out all this space too. And then I'm going to select the list text. And that's when I can go up and I can select a bulleted list or a numbered list. And Word automatically indents that list over. And what's really great here is that, let's say I forgot a step. Well, as soon as I go in and add a new line, Word renumbers for me. If you're creating those lists manually, like the way I had it before, step 1, step 2, step 3, and I skipped a step, then you'd have to go in and manually renumber your list. And for a short list, that's not a big deal. But, you know, the way life works is when you have a really long list of like 89 items, and then you realize you forgot the second most important item, because it'll, of course, be the second item. You'll add that in, and then you have to go in and change all the numbers manually. So again, this saves you time by using these tools. It's creating accessible content is actually quite a time saver if you're using the tools correctly. So, and the reason why you want to use the list tool is that as a sighted user, someone can look at that list, they can look at the list with these instructions and quickly see that it only has 3 items. And so, okay, cool, it's a short list. Not a lot of steps to making a list accessible. But if you're using a screen reader or, you know, text-to-speech, and you hear step 1, then that next question is going to be, okay, wait a second, how many steps are there? If a list isn't formatted correctly, that person has to listen all the way through until they reach the end in order to know how long that list is. But if you've formatted it as a list, then it'll announce, you know, it's a list with 3 items, or it's a list with 89 items. It'll tell that user just how long that list is, which is something that I think sighted users sometimes take for granted. So that's the importance of formatting a list correctly. Okay, next topic, columns of text. Oh, this one's a pain. So I think oftentimes when people create columns of text, they use the indent or tab key. And what's going to happen is assistive technology is just going to read from left to right. And so I have 3 columns on the screen of 3 people's favorite colors. And if I was using assistive technology, it would read across as Steve, Jess, Angela, green, brown, blue, pink, red, green, gray, polka dots, sparkles. So imagine if I then said, okay, what are Jess's favorite colors? Trying to pull those pieces out with the way that sequence was read would be pretty difficult. So when you're creating columns, you actually want to start, and I can show you here. These are not real columns because there's all this space between Steve and Jess, which shows all I did was tab, and it looks like space bar over. And so someone, you know, actually if they're listening to that, it would be, you know, Steve blank, 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 Jess. It'd be a pretty ugly experience. And to fix this isn't as simple. Hopefully your columns are nice and simple because what you're going to have to do is retype those columns. And I'll do that for us here really quickly, actually. I'm prepared on this one. So here I have one, it looks like one long list. And I'll just kind of bold our names real quick so that we can see it a little bit better. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to select all of the text in that list. And then I'm going to go to the Layout tab. You can do Alt-P. And then go over to Columns. And I'm going to select I'm going to select 3 columns. We've got 3 people. And automatically Word has put it into the 3 columns. And so that way when it's going to be read, it's going to read Steve, green, pink, gray, and then Jess, brown, red, polka dots, Angela, blue, green, sparkles. So there's lots of tools available in the Layout tab with page breaks or section breaks, the columns, that can be really beneficial. All right, so moving on to fonts. So in terms of accessibility of fonts, there's a number of different principles to keep in mind. The first thing is to use real text rather than text within graphics. So what happens is sometimes people will take pictures of text and then plop it into a document. In that case, it's an image, so we would actually need alt text in order to make sure someone can access what that graphic says. So just in general, it's best to always use text rather than graphics. And to make sure you're dealing with real text, you should be able to select it. So that's something that's probably more relevant for PDFs when you don't know if it's scanned or if it's been a Word document that's converted. If you can select text, then it should be real text. Second, you want to use simple, basic, easy to read fonts. Try to keep it with kind of, you've got the sans serif fonts, which means that they don't have the feet on them. So for digital materials, sans serif is considered easier to read. For print materials, serif fonts are considered easier, and so that's why you see like Times New Roman used for print materials. But in general, I think more people prefer or kind of opt towards the sans serif fonts. Try to use a limited number of fonts. Keep it just clean and simple. And then also you want to ensure that you have sufficient contrast between the text and the background. And Word doesn't actually check that for you, but at the end I'll show you a tool that does check color contrast so that you can make sure you've got good contrast between the text and the background. Avoid small font sizes. So for print, that typically means don't go lower than 11-point font. I've read for web, that means don't go below 14-point font, but that does seem a little small. Generally speaking, you just want to make sure people can magnify the screen if needed. And also some of this is just common sense. Certain fonts are smaller than others. And so if you're going with a really small font and it's at size 11, maybe you do want to bump it up. So some of this is your own judgment that you need to just kind of keep some of this stuff in mind. And then also try to limit the use of font variations such as bold, italics, and all caps. All caps typically indicates yelling, so it's always good to avoid that. And just try to really just try to keep it simple and clean. If I see documents that are filled with all sorts of bold text, italicized text, highlighted, all different colors, one, it's tacky, but secondly, that can be really confusing for a user to navigate. So the next section I want to talk about is descriptive hyperlinks. So when you want to include a web address in your document, you want to use a descriptive hyperlink, and that involves embedding the URL into the text. And so I've done that down here. It says, you can listen to what it's like by playing this short audio of JAWS reading a hyperlink. And when my cursor is on top of it, I can actually see the web link that I would be taken to. Notice up here, when I hover over descriptive hyperlinks, and hyperlinks is bright blue and underlined, nothing's happening. And this is in part just a reminder of be careful how you use and how you format your text. We'll talk about color in the next section, but the way that I've formatted this text makes it appear as though it's a live link, and the reality is it's not. So that's just one of the things to be mindful of, and we can fix that. I'm just going to go get back to my home tab and hit heading level 2 again, and it'll clear out that formatting. So up here, right above this section, I have the information about fonts. It says content from http:// webaim.org/techniques/fonts. That's actually not too bad of a URL, but again, let's try to be more descriptive. I'm going to type out WebAIM. I'm going to select that URL. I'm going to just select cut so I remove it from the document. And then I'm going to select the text that I want to put that hyperlink into. And when I right-click, I can insert the hyperlink and just paste it into the address bar. So again, you can right-click, or once you've selected that text, you can do Shift F10, and that'll open up that menu to be able to drop the hyperlink into. And now, I can open the hyperlink and navigate to WebAIM if I want. It's turned it bright blue and underlined so that visually users know that it's a link. And if someone's using assistive technology, it will say content from link WebAIM, and so they're being told where to go. All right, I'm going to pause just a second, and I need to make Monique the host again. Thanks everyone for your patience. Goodness, we have a lot of people here. There you are, Monique. Okay. Okay, there we go. And so, again, adding the descriptive hyperlinks, one, is just better for all users. It makes for a cleaner looking document. It tells users where they're going to be taken when they click on that link. But one thing that can be kind of problematic is if you're going to print the document. If we're going to print this out, then someone could say, oh, okay, content from WebAIM, what's that? And there is a setting somewhere in Word, and I have to admit, I've never kind of really explored this too far, but someone else did. And there's a setting that you can have it so that when you print an item, the hyperlinks are displayed. And I have to apologize, I don't know exactly what to do. But what I oftentimes do, and in part because I use a lot of Google Docs, is following that hyperlink. I might do parentheses, and then I'll type full URL, and then I'll paste the link. I don't let it go live. It's going to try to go live on me, but then I'm just going to do Control-V to kill the live link. And the thought here is that if someone's using a screen reader, they would hear content from link WebAIM full URL, and it kind of gives them a heads up that the full URL for WebAIM is about to be read to them, which would hopefully allow them to skip over it and not have to listen. Another thing that I do with very ugly URLs, such as those from Google, is I oftentimes will turn them into tiny URLs or bit.ly links, and that way it's short and sweet. I customize it. So for instance, the live chat links for this webinar, bit.ly/SBCTC live, that's something that I can memorize. And so it's easier for me to kind of call on that link and share it with others. So there's kind of a variety of tips and tricks. I'll try to look into that print option and see if I can pull something together when I send out the recording of the webinar. Okay, and then the next section is about color. And I've already kind of hit on this. You want to be careful with how you use color. So I used all different colors to make that section title, and there's really bad color contrast as a result, so it might not even look like it says color for some people. And again, I can just highlight that and make it a heading 2 once again. And once you kind of redo it, it'll strip out that previous formatting. And you never want to use color alone to convey meaning because, again, someone might be colorblind, and so if you're saying items to edit are in red, that could be really problematic for someone. So try to always kind of pair it with something else. Maybe it's going to be underlined as well. So think about, again, that discussion about descriptive hyperlinks. It's blue, but it's also underlined. And that helps provide two different ways in which we're communicating that there's a link present. So color alone doesn't indicate that it's a link. Okay, so the accessibility checker. This is a nice tool in Microsoft Word. You can check your document to see if you have any accessibility problems. And that's nice, but there are certain things that it's going to miss. So a few things to be aware of. The checker isn't going to point out if you're not using headings. So again, that most important piece to your document, using headings, if you don't have any in there, the checker is not going to call it out. It can't determine if your alt text is appropriate. So we could go into an image, and someone I think wanted me to do that again. Let's go in, and I'm going to change the alt text to this image to just a bunch of rubbish, right? It's meaningless. We'll close it out. But what's going to happen is when we run the accessibility checker, it's not going to say that the alt text is gibberish. It's simply checking to see that alt text is present. So that's problematic. It won't tell you anything in terms of the type of font you're using, the size, or the color contrast. And the checker can't always determine if your headings are in the right order. That's something that you need to do. And there's a nice way to kind of check your heading levels, and that's with the navigation pane. And you can kind of go through and see, are those heading levels nested appropriately? And for this document, I think it looks pretty good. But let's go ahead and let's run the accessibility checker. I'm going to go to File, Alt-F, and then Check for Issues. I'm going to go down and select Check Accessibility. And I've got a couple of things noted. So first, it says that my table is missing alt text. And when you click on this, what's kind of cool about the checker, let's see if I can make this bigger for you. Actually, you might not be able to see it at all. Sorry, I'm looking at a different monitor. Down below the list of errors, it'll tell you why you need to fix it and how to fix it, which is a really nice feature. However, you sometimes have to be smarter than the machine. So again, the checker isn't always accurate. But I want to mention in the alt text with the table, there's disagreement on if you need alt text for a table or not. Since we already have a caption provided for the table, we've formatted the table so that someone can navigate it in a meaningful way. And so it's kind of up to you, unless someone wants to chime in at the end and share the benefits of having alt text for the table. For this table, I might spell it out a little bit more. Average commute time by county. The table includes county of residence, number of employees, and then the average commute time for, the counties of Thurston, Mason, Pierce, and Lewis. You might give a little bit more information about what type of information is presented in that table. But again, there's not always a single right way for how to do things. There's sometimes disagreement on what's better. But the other thing I want to point out is that it mentions a warning, which is repeated blank characters. And you can see we have a lot of those blank characters were because we tried to create columns just by tabbing over and using spaces. I'm going to clear that out. And notice those errors disappear once they're addressed. And then I have more blank spaces at the end of the discussion about URLs. And the reason why it calls those out is that we tend to accumulate a lot of blank space at the end of a document, and so it might lead the user to think that they've reached the end if they're just hearing blank, blank, blank. Then they might not be aware that there's more information to come. And so again, that's where we can use kind of layout to, do page breaks, to move things around, or you can alter the spacing on things. If you don't like how it looks, you can add space after a paragraph or before. There's different ways to create space without using new lines or the space bar. So if you're converting to PDF, you just want to make sure that document structure tags for accessibility is checked. And so if I go to File, Save As, and once I select the file type to be PDF, I'm given this Options button. And it's probably really tiny and difficult to read, but you can see that it says Document Structure Tags for Accessibility, and that box is checked. And so what that means is that when I save this document as a PDF, my heading levels will carry over into the PDF tag tree, so that I won't have to redo that piece. And that's a huge time saver if you're insistent on using PDF. So one last thing as we start to wrap up, there is a really awesome toolbar that I would recommend for everyone. It's out of Vision Australia, and it's the Document Accessibility Toolbar. And I have it installed on my version of Word. It's this Accessibility tab. And what it does is it essentially puts all of the accessibility tools into one spot so that you don't have to jump around from tab to tab. You've got your different heading levels for the document structure, your list options. When you insert an image, let's just do this because it's so cool. We'll go find an image. We'll find a cat. So as soon as I inserted my image, I'm prompted to add alt text right there. So 2 curious cats. I can also, if it's just a decorative image, I can select decorative image instead. And that way we don't have to go digging to find or to insert the alt text. The same thing happens when you insert a table. It's asking if I have column and row headers, or if I have column headers only, or row headers only. That again helps kind of ensure that that table is accessibly formatted. So that's really awesome. It makes it so much easier to ensure that your document's accessible. Another super cool tool that I want to show is it has a color contrast checker. So it won't scan the whole document, but you can select a certain amount of text, select that. The inspect, looks like a little color gradient, and then hit find, and so it's scanning, and it says no issues found, so that's really cool. Let's try to create an issue though. see what happens. I'm gonna do this light orange. Again, it's limited on what it can scan. I have to kind of select, and then it says a found issue. So it points me to the area where there's poor color contrast, which is pretty cool, since that's something that Word does not check for. So there's a lot of different features that come with this toolbar, and when I send out the recording, it'll have the link, or you can go to visionaustralia.org/DAT. And that's something I'll go ahead and open the chat now that we've reached the end, and I will type that into the chat. So that is the end of the webinar. We've got about 5 minutes. So I think Monique's been doing an amazing job tracking questions and helping everyone. And Monique, can you send me that Google Doc? Can you actually send it to Jess, not Jess Thompson? Oh, wait. Okay. All right, so let's see. Oh, gosh, okay, a lot of questions. We'll see how many we can get through today. So why use heading 1 for the title rather than the title style? The way I understand it, and I could be wrong here, so if someone wants to chime in, feel free. There should only be one heading 1 for a document. So I think if you're writing something like a book, then maybe you want title for the book title, and then your chapter titles might be heading 1. But when I think about formatting with Word documents, I also try to think about like how I would format something on the web with HTML. And in that case, the title would be the page. And actually in the, and you can see, let's see, am I still sharing? Yes. You can see in the accessibility pane, and it's something I didn't address, is in the metadata for your document, you actually provide the document title, and that makes it kind of more searchable and oftentimes gives it a more meaningful title than whatever the default may be. And so I typically create short enough content that I just have that kind of single heading 1 for the title, and then go from there rather than using title, because I'm not creating multiple pieces of content that might be broken out or used individually in one document. But if you are creating something that has multiple pieces like that, then the title attribute might be more meaningful for you. But for me, because I'm also using online spaces like Canvas, if I wanted to paste something from Word into Canvas and I want to ensure that things carry over correctly, then I start with heading level 1. And again, there's not always one right way. There's disagreement on some pieces, but that's how I do it. Is there a way to share modified styles to other users? I believe there is. I think I've shared a style template with a colleague a while back. And there's this really awesome tool that I love called Google, where you might be able to find some more information on that, and I'll see if I can plug in some resources when I send out the recording. So if we save a set of headings as a style, can we make it appear by default when users open Word? I don't know if that's the case. They might have to import that style and save it as their default. I don't know that you can do that for them. So I know at our agency, when they created new templates, when we open that template document, the style that they want us to use is present, but that's because we're opening their document and then editing it. And that seems to be the easiest approach rather than hoping everyone will import the styles. So again, something to kind of play around with, but you can't control someone else's version of Word unless you have, I guess, that privilege. Maybe you work in an office where you can. I personally cannot, so it's not something I've been able to test. So how do we add a text box for check marks for forms? So there's a couple pieces here. Again, this webinar is to cover the basics, and this is what I expect. So the accessibility tab that came out of Vision Australia actually has these features built in where you can add an edit box or a check box. Oftentimes what you need to do in Word is you need to get access to the developer tab. It's hidden by default, so you have to customize your toolbar, customize the ribbon and make sure the developer tab is showing. And that will give you features to build in forms to Word. If you're going to save them as PDF, though, you're going to have to fix it up in PDF with Adobe to make sure that form is fillable. Were we supposed to be able to see the alt text action, please? So I don't know if my doing it again helped. And it looks like when I look at a separate display, it does show format picture. But if you have the chat open or the participants pane open, you probably weren't able to see it. Oh, technology. So I've made my screen a little bit smaller, which might help. But I right-clicked on the image, select Format Picture, and then the description, the title and description pane open. So if you weren't able to see that before, hopefully you can now. And you would type the alt text into the description tab. And then the next question, can an example of what is seen on a screen reader provided to better see the end result of our accessibility formatting? So a screen reader would not give you a visual. There are features with different screen readers where you can actually open the text of what the screen reader is reading. But I cannot provide you with an example of what you would see from a screen reader. Okay. When adding headers, is it okay to use the title instead of heading 1? So I think we just talked about that. Question that has come up from Cascadia is the URLs when in print documents. Printing this and handing it to students. Students use the URL. So I think we covered that when we talked about the descriptive hyperlink and the different options to paste in the full URL. And again, I'll follow up on the print instructions. Is bolding, italics, or underline indicated by a screen reader? Just wondering how to emphasize something like how she said not to use edits in red because someone might not be able to see that. So part of it would be, using some of those editing features available in Word, such as, leaving comments. Track changes is a pain, I think, for anyone to navigate. And I'm not a screen reader user, so I can't speak to that. But if anyone else wants to chime in, then you're more than welcome to. And a question just disappeared. So I hope I hit on them. If anyone else wants to chime in and speak to any of these questions, you're more than welcome to. I'm by no means an expert. I can introduce you to the basics, which is my intent. But some of these are more specific to, I think, documents that you're creating that I've not laid eyes on. And then I see one more question. Text boxes, should these be avoided? Yes. Yes, please avoid text boxes. You're at risk of a text box not being read. It could be skipped over entirely because it's hard to know where in the flow of the text on a document that text box, that information in a text box would be read. So in general, I think whether it's PowerPoint or Word, you want to avoid those. Adobe would be one way in which if you're working in Adobe with a PDF, you could control when that text box, when the content from that text box is read a little bit more. But in Word, it might be difficult. So, any comments from the audience? Anyone want to share lessons they've learned or tips that they have? I know we're a few minutes over, but there's, I'm sure, plenty of expertise in this group that's gathered. Quiet expertise, perhaps. So, if not, then I will try to find some of those additional resources to send out with the webinar recording. And for anyone joining next week, I think we're talking about PowerPoint and just, again, some of the basics on creating accessible PowerPoint. So hopefully I didn't overwhelm you. I feel a little overwhelmed, but that's all in good fun, right? So everyone have a good rest of your day, and we will possibly see you next week. And thank you, Monique, for all of your help.